Master word list. Words starting with letter I. Ichthyology means study of fish. For example, Jacques Cousteau's programs about sea life have advanced the cause of ichthyology. Icon means religious image, idol. For example, the icons on the walls of the church were painted in the 13th century. Iconoclastic means attacking cherished traditions. For example, deeply iconoclastic, Jean Genet deliberately set out to shock conventional theatergoers with his radical plays. Ideology means system of ideas of a group. For example, for people who had grown up believing in the communist ideology, it was hard to adjust to capitalism. Idiom means distinctive style. For example, the phrase to lose one's marbles is an idiom. If I say that Joe's lost his marbles, I'm not asking you to find some for him. Idiosyncrasy means individual trait, usually odd in nature. For example, one of Richard Nixon's little idiosyncrasies was his liking for ketchup on cottage cheese. Idolatry means worship of idols, excessive admiration. For example, such idolatry of singers of country music is typical of the excessive enthusiasm of youth. Ignite means kindle, light. For example, when Desi crooned, "Baby, light my fire," literal-minded Lucy looked around for some paper to ignite. Ignoble means of lowly origin, unworthy. For example, this plan is inspired by ignoble motives and I must, therefore, oppose it. Ignominy means deep disgrace, shame or dishonor. For example, to lose the ping-pong match to a trained chimpanzee. How could Rollo stand the ignominy of his defeat? Illicit means illegal. For example, the defense attorney maintained that his client had never performed any illicit action. Illimitable means infinite. For example, man, having explored the far corners of the earth, is now reaching out into illimitable space. Illuminate means brighten, enlighten. For example, just as a lamp can illuminate a dark room, a perceptive comment can illuminate a knotty problem. Illusion means misleading vision. For example, it is easy to create an optical illusion in which lines of equal length appear different. Illusory means deceptive, not real. For example, unfortunately, the costs of running the lemonade stand were so high that Tom's profits proved illusory. Imbalance means lack of balance or symmetry, disproportion. For example, to correct racial imbalance in the schools, school boards have bused black children into white neighborhoods and white children into black ones. Imbibe means drink in. For example, the dry soil imbibed the rain quickly. Immaculate means spotless, flawless, absolutely clean. For example, Ken and Jessica were wonderful tenants and left the apartment in immaculate condition when they moved out. Imminent means near at hand, impending. For example, Rosa was such a last-minute worker that she could never start writing a paper till the deadline was imminent. Immobility means state of being immovable. For example, modern armies cannot afford the luxury of immobility, as they are vulnerable to attack while standing still. Immune means resistant to, free or exempt from. For example, fortunately, Florence had contracted chickenpox as a child and was immune to it when her baby broke out in spots. Immutable means unchangeable. For example, all things change over time, nothing is immutable. Impair means injure, hurt. For example, drinking alcohol can impair your ability to drive safely. If you're going to drink, don't drive. Impale means pierce. For example, he was impaled by the spear hurled by his adversary. Impalpable means imperceptible, intangible. For example, the ash is so fine that it is impalpable to the touch, but it can be seen as a fine layer covering the window ledge. Impart means reveal or tell, grant. For example, Polly begged Grandma to impart her recipe for arugula, but her grandmother wouldn't say a word. Impartial means not biased, fair. For example, knowing she could not be impartial about her own child, Jo refused to judge any match in which Billy was competing. Impassable means not able to be traveled. For example, a giant redwood had fallen across the highway, blocking all 4 lanes. The road was impassable. Impasse means deadlock. For example, in this impasse, all turned to prayer as their last hope. Impassive means without feeling. For example, refusing to let the enemy see how deeply shaken he was by his capture, the prisoner kept his face impassive. Impeach means charge with crime in office. For example, the angry congressman wanted to impeach the president for his misdeeds. Impeccable means faultless. For example, the uncrowned queen of the fashion industry, Diana, was acclaimed for her impeccable taste. Impecunious means without money. For example, though Scrooge claimed he was too impecunious to give alms, he easily could have afforded to be charitable. Impede means hinder, block, delay. For example, a series of accidents impeded the launching of the space shuttle. Impediment means hindrance, stumbling block. For example, she had a speech impediment that prevented her speaking clearly. Impel means drive or force onward. For example, a strong feeling of urgency impelled her. If she failed to finish the project right then, she knew that she would never get it done. Impenetrable means not able to be pierced or entered, beyond understanding. For example, how could the murderer have gotten into the locked room? To Watson, the mystery, like the room, was impenetrable. Impending means nearing, approaching. For example, the entire country was saddened by the news of his impending death. Impenitent means not repentant. For example, we could see from his tough guy attitude that he was impenitent. Imperative means absolutely necessary, critically important. For example, it is imperative that you be extremely agreeable to Great Aunt Maud when she comes to tea, otherwise she might not leave you that $1 million in her will. Imperceptible means unnoticeable, undetectable. For example, fortunately, the stain on the blouse was imperceptible after the blouse had gone through the wash. Imperial means like an emperor, related to an empire. For example, when hotel owner Leona Helmsley appeared in ads as Queen Leona standing guard over the Palace Hotel, her critics mocked her imperial fancies. Imperious means haughty. For example, Jane rather liked a man to be masterful, but Mr. Rochester seemed so bent on getting his own way that he was actually imperious. Impermeable means not permitting passage through its substance. For example, this new material is impermeable to liquids. Impertinent means insolent, rude. For example, his neighbor's impertinent curiosity about his lack of dates angered Ted. Imperturbable means calm, placid, composed. For example, in the midst of the battle, the Duke of Wellington remained imperturbable and in full command of the situation despite the hysteria and panic all around him. Impervious means impenetrable, incapable of being damaged. For example, the carpet salesman told Simone that his most expensive brand of floor covering was warranted to be impervious to ordinary wear and tear. Impetuous means violent, hasty, rash. For example, leap before you look was the motto suggested by one particularly impetuous young man. Impetus means incentive, stimulus. For example, a new federal highway program would create jobs and give added impetus to our economic recovery. Impiety means irreverence, lack of respect for God. For example, when members of the youth group draped the church in toilet paper one Halloween, the minister reprimanded them for their impiety. Impinge means infringe, touch, collide with. For example, how could they be married without impinging on one another's freedom? Impious means irreverent. For example, the congregation was offended by her impious remarks. Implacable means incapable of being pacified. For example, Madame Defarge was the implacable enemy of the Evremond family. Implausible means unlikely, unbelievable. For example, though her alibi seemed implausible, it in fact turned out to be true. Implement means put into effect, supply with tools. For example, the mayor was unwilling to implement the plan until she was sure it had the governor's backing. Implicate means incriminate, show to be involved. For example, here's the deal: if you agree to take the witness stand and implicate your partners in crime, the prosecution will recommend that the judge go easy in sentencing you. Implication means something hinted at or suggested. For example, when Miss Watson said she hadn't seen her purse since the last time Jim was in the house, the implication was that she suspected Jim had taken it. Implicit means understood but not stated. For example, Jack never told Jill he adored her. He believed his love was implicit in his actions. Implore means beg. For example, he implored her to give him a second chance. Imply means suggest a meaning not expressed, signify. For example, when Aunt Millie said, "My, that's a big piece of pie, young man," was she implying that Bobby was being a glutton in helping himself to such a huge piece? Importunate means urging, demanding. For example, he tried to hide from his importunate creditors until his allowance arrived. Importune means beg persistently. For example, Democratic and Republican phone solicitors importuned her for contributions so frequently that she decided to give nothing to either party. Imposter means someone who assumes a false identity. For example, Holmes exposed the doctor as an imposter. Impotent means weak, ineffective. For example, although he wished to break the nicotine habit, he found himself impotent in resisting the craving for a cigarette. Impoverished means poor. For example, the loss of their farm left the family impoverished and without hope. Impregnable means invulnerable. For example, until the development of the airplane as a military weapon, the fort was considered impregnable. Impromptu means without previous preparation, on the spur of the moment. For example, the judges were amazed that she could make such a thorough, well-supported presentation in an impromptu speech. Impropriety means improperness, unsuitableness. For example, because of the impropriety of the punk rockers' t-shirt and jeans, the management refused to admit him to the hotel's very formal dining room. Improvident means thriftless. For example, he was constantly being warned to mend his improvident ways and begin to save for a rainy day. Improvise means compose on the spur of the moment. For example, she would sit at the piano and improvise for hours on themes from Bach and Handel. Imprudent means lacking caution, injudicious. For example, it is imprudent to exercise vigorously and become overheated when you are unwell. Impudence means impertinence, insolence. For example, kissed on the cheek by a perfect stranger, Lady Catherine exclaimed, "Of all the nerve! Young man, I should have you horsewhipped for your impudence." Impugn means dispute or contradict, challenge. For example, our treasurer was furious when the Finance Committee's report impugned the accuracy of his financial records and recommended that he should take bonehead math. Impunity means freedom from punishment or harm. For example, a 98-pound weakling can't attack a beachfront bully with impunity. The poor, puny guy is sure to get mashed. Inadvertently means unintentionally, by oversight, carelessly. For example, Judy's great fear was that she might inadvertently omit a question on the exam and mismark her whole answer sheet. Inalienable means not to be taken away, non-transferable. For example, the Declaration of Independence mentions the inalienable rights that all of us possess. Inane means silly, senseless. For example, there's no point to what you're saying. Why are you bothering to make such inane remarks? Inanimate means lifeless. For example, she was asked to identify the still and inanimate body. Inarticulate means speechless, producing indistinct speech. For example, he became inarticulate with rage and uttered sounds without meaning. Inaugurate means start, initiate. For example, the airline decided to inaugurate its new route to the Far East with a special reduced fare offer. Incandescent means strikingly bright, shining with intense heat. For example, if you leave on an incandescent light bulb, it quickly grows too hot to touch. Incantation means singing or chanting of magic spells. For example, uttering incantations to make the brew more potent, the witch doctor stirred the liquid in the cauldron. Incapacitate means disable. For example, during the winter, many people were incapacitated by respiratory ailments. Incarcerate means imprison. For example, the civil rights workers were willing to be arrested and even incarcerated if by their imprisonment they could serve the cause. Incarnation means act of assuming a human body. For example, the incarnation of Jesus Christ is a basic tenet of Christian theology. Incendiary means arsonist. For example, the fire spread in such an unusual manner that the fire department chiefs were certain that it had been set by an incendiary. Incense means enrage, infuriate. For example, cruelty to defenseless animals incensed Kit. The very idea brought tears of anger to her eyes. Incentive means spur, motive. For example, Mike's strong desire to outshine his big sister was all the incentive he needed to do well in school. Inception means start, beginning. For example, she was involved with the project from its inception. Incessant means uninterrupted, unceasing. For example, in a famous TV commercial, the frog's incessant croaking goes on and on until eventually it turns into a single word, Budweiser. Inchoate means recently begun, rudimentary, elementary. For example, before the creation, the world was an inchoate mass. Incidence means rate of occurrence, particular occurrence. For example, health professionals expressed great concern over the high incidence of infant mortality in major urban areas. Incidental means not essential, minor. For example, the scholarship covered his major expenses at college and some of his incidental expenses as well. Incipient means beginning, in an early stage. For example, I will go to sleep early for I want to break an incipient cold. Incisive means cutting, sharp. For example, his incisive remarks made us see the fallacy in our plans. Incite means arouse to action, motivate. For example, in a fiery speech, Mario incited his fellow students to go out on strike to protest the university's anti-affirmative action stand. Inclement means stormy, unkind. For example, in inclement weather, I like to curl up on the sofa with a good book and listen to the storm blowing outside. Incline means slope, slant. For example, the architect recommended that the nursing home's ramp be rebuilt because its incline was too steep for wheelchairs. Inclined means tending or leaning toward, bent. For example, though I am inclined to be skeptical, the witness's manner inclines me to believe his story. Inclusive means tending to include all. For example, the comedian turned down the invitation to join the Players Club, saying any club that would let him in was too inclusive for him. Incoherent means unintelligible, illogical. For example, the excited fan blushed and stammered, her words becoming almost incoherent in the thrill of meeting her favorite rock star face to face. Incompatible means inharmonious. For example, the married couple argued incessantly and finally decided to separate because they were incompatible. Incongruous means not fitting, absurd. For example, Dave saw nothing incongruous about wearing sneakers with his tuxedo. He couldn't understand why his date took one look at him and started to laugh. Inconsequential means insignificant, unimportant. For example, brushing off Ali's apologies for having broken the wine glass, Tamara said, "Don't worry about it, it's inconsequential." Inconsistency means state of being self-contradictory. For example, how are lawyers different from agricultural inspectors? While lawyers check inconsistencies in witnesses' statements, agricultural inspectors check inconsistencies in grade A eggs. Incontinent means lacking self-restraint. For example, his incontinent behavior off stage so shocked many people that they refused to attend the plays and movies in which he appeared. Incontrovertible means indisputable, not open to question. For example, unless you find the evidence against my client absolutely incontrovertible, you must declare her not guilty of this charge. Incorporate means combine, unite. For example, breaking with precedent, President Truman ordered the military to incorporate blacks into every branch of the armed services. Incorporeal means lacking a material body, insubstantial. For example, while Casper the Friendly Ghost is an incorporeal being, nevertheless he and his fellow ghosts make quite an impact on the physical world. Incorrigible means not correctable. For example, though Widow Douglas hoped to reform Huck, Miss Watson called him incorrigible and said he would come to no good end. Incredulous means withholding belief, skeptical. For example, when Jack claimed he hadn't eaten the jelly donut, Jill took an incredulous look at his smeared face and laughed. Increment means increase. For example, the new contract calls for a 10% increment in salary for each employee for the next 2 years. Incriminate means accuse. For example, the evidence gathered against the racketeers incriminates some high public officials as well. Incrustation means hard coating or crust. For example, in dry dock, we scraped off the incrustation of dirt and barnacles that covered the hull of the ship. Incubate means hatch, scheme. For example, inasmuch as our supply of electricity is cut off, we shall have to rely on the hens to incubate these eggs. Inculcate means teach, instill. For example, in an effort to inculcate religious devotion, the officials ordered that the school day begin with the singing of a hymn. Incumbent means currently holding an office. For example, it is incumbent upon all incumbent elected officials to keep accurate records of expenses incurred in office. Incur means bring upon oneself. For example, his parents refused to pay any future debts he might incur. Incursion means temporary invasion. For example, the nightly incursions and hit-and-run raids of our neighbors across the border tried the patience of the country to the point where we decided to retaliate in force. Indefatigable means tireless. For example, although the effort of taking out the garbage tired Wayne out for the entire morning, when it came to partying, he was indefatigable. Indelible means not able to be erased. For example, the indelible ink left a permanent mark on my shirt. Indentation means deep recess. For example, you can tell one tree from another by examining their leaves and noting the differences in the indentations along the edges of the leaves. Indenture means bind as servant or apprentice to master. For example, many immigrants could come to America only after they had indentured themselves for several years. Indeterminate means uncertain, not clearly fixed, indefinite. For example, that interest rates shall rise appears certain, when they will do so, however, remains indeterminate. Indicative means suggestive, implying. For example, a lack of appetite may be indicative of a major mental or physical disorder. Indices means signs, indications. For example, many college admissions officers believe that SAT scores and high school grades are the best indices of a student's potential to succeed in college. Indict means charge. For example, the district attorney didn't want to indict the suspect until she was sure she had a strong enough case to convince a jury. Indifferent means unmoved or unconcerned by. For example, because Anne felt no desire to marry, she was indifferent to Carl's constant proposals. Indigenous means native. For example, cigarettes are made of tobacco, a plant indigenous to the New World. Indigent means poor, destitute. For example, someone who is truly indigent can't even afford to buy a pack of cigarettes. Indignation means anger at an injustice. For example, he felt indignation at the ill treatment of helpless animals. Indignity means offensive or insulting treatment. For example, although he seemed to accept cheerfully the indignities heaped upon him, he was inwardly very angry. Indiscretion means lack of tactfulness or sound judgment. For example, terrified that the least indiscretion could jeopardize his political career, the novice politician never uttered an unguarded word. Indiscriminate means choosing at random, confused. For example, she disapproved of her son's indiscriminate television viewing and decided to restrict him to educational programs. Indisputable means too certain to be disputed. For example, in the face of these indisputable statements, I withdraw my complaint. Indissoluble means permanent. For example, the indissoluble bonds of marriage are all too often being dissolved. Indoctrinate means instruct in a doctrine or ideology. For example, Cuban Americans resisted sending Elian Gonzalez back to Cuba because he would be indoctrinated there with communist principles. Indolent means lazy. For example, couch potatoes lead an indolent life lying back on their Lazaboy recliners watching TV. Indomitable means unconquerable, unyielding. For example, focusing on her game despite all her personal problems, tennis champion Steffi Graf proved she had an indomitable will to win. Indubitable means unable to be doubted, unquestionable. For example, auditioning for the chorus line, Molly was an indubitable hit. The director fired the leading lady and hired Molly in her place. Induce means persuade, bring about. For example, after the quarrel, Tina said nothing could induce her to talk to Tony again. Indulgent means humoring, yielding, lenient. For example, Jay's mom was excessively indulgent. She bought him every Nintendo cartridge and video game on the market. Industrious means diligent, hardworking. For example, look busy when the boss walks by your desk. It never hurts to appear industrious. Inebriated means habitually intoxicated, drunk. For example, Abe was inebriated more often than he was sober. Ineffable means cannot be expressed in speech. For example, such ineffable joy must be experienced, it cannot be described. Ineffectual means not effective, weak. For example, because the candidate failed to get across his message to the public, his campaign was ineffectual. Inefficacious means not effective, unable to produce a desired result. For example, all Lois's coaxing and urging was inefficacious. Clark still refused to join her and Superman for dinner. Inept means lacking skill, unsuited, incompetent. For example, the inept glovemaker was all thumbs. Inequity means unfairness. For example, in demanding equal pay for equal work, women protest the basic inequity of a system that gives greater financial rewards to men. Inert means inactive, lacking power to move. For example, "Get up, you lazybones," she cried to her husband, who lay in bed inert. Inevitable means unavoidable. For example, though death and taxes are both supposedly inevitable, some people avoid paying taxes for years. Inexorable means relentless, unyielding. For example, after listening to the pleas for clemency, the judge was inexorable and gave the convicted man the maximum punishment allowed by law. Infallible means unerring. For example, we must remember that none of us is infallible. We all make mistakes. Infamous means notoriously bad. For example, Charles Manson and Jeffrey Dahmer are both infamous killers. Infantile means childish. For example, when will he outgrow such infantile behavior? Infer means deduce, conclude. For example, from the students' glazed looks, it was easy for me to infer that they were bored out of their minds. Infernal means pertaining to hell, devilish. For example, Batman was baffled. He could think of no way to hinder the Joker's infernal scheme to destroy the city. Infidel means unbeliever. For example, the Saracens made war against the infidels. Infiltrate means penetrate. For example, in order to be able to infiltrate enemy lines at night without being seen, the scouts darkened their faces and wore black coveralls. Infinitesimal means very small. For example, in the 20th century, physicists have made their greatest discoveries about the characteristics of infinitesimal objects like the atom and its parts. Infirmity means weakness. For example, her greatest infirmity was lack of willpower. Inflated means exaggerated, enlarged. For example, his claims about the new product were inflated. It did not work as well as he had promised. Influx means flowing into. For example, the influx of refugees into the country has taxed the relief agencies severely. Informal means absence of ceremony, casual. For example, the English teacher preferred informal discussions to prepared lectures. Infraction means violation of a rule or regulation, breach. For example, when Dennis Rodman butted heads with that referee, he committed a clear infraction of NBA rules. Infuriate means enrage, anger. For example, her big brother's teasing always infuriated Margaret. No matter how hard she tried to keep her temper, he always got her goat. Infusion means act of instilling a quality. For example, the rookie quarterback brought an infusion of new life and vigor to the tired team. Ingenious means clever, resourceful. For example, Kit admired the ingenious way that her computer keyboard opened up to reveal the built-in CD-ROM below. Ingenue means an actress who plays parts. For example, although she was 40, she still insisted that she be cast as an ingenue and refused to play more mature roles. Ingenuous means naive and trusting, unsophisticated. For example, the woodsman had not realized how ingenuous Little Red Riding Hood was until he heard that she had gone off for a walk in the woods with the big bad wolf. Ingrained means deeply established, firmly rooted. For example, try as they would, the missionaries were unable to uproot the ingrained superstitions of the natives. Ingrate means ungrateful person. For example, that ingrate Bob sneered at the tie I gave him. Ingratiate means become popular with. For example, he tried to ingratiate himself into her parents' good graces. Inherent means firmly established by nature or habit. For example, Katya's inherent love of justice caused her to champion anyone she considered treated unfairly by society. Inhibit means restrain, retard, or prevent. For example, only two things inhibited him from taking a punch at Mike Tyson: Tyson's left hook and Tyson's right jab. Inimical means unfriendly, hostile, harmful, detrimental. For example, I've always been friendly to Martha. Why is she so inimical to me? Inimitable means matchless, not able to be imitated. For example, we admire Auden for his inimitable use of language. He is one of a kind. Iniquitous means wicked, immoral, unrighteous. For example, whether or not King Richard III was responsible for the murder of the two young princes in the Tower, it was an iniquitous deed. Initiate means begin, originate. For example, the college is about to initiate a program in reducing math anxiety among students. Injurious means harmful. For example, smoking cigarettes can be injurious to your health. Inkling means hint. For example, this came as a complete surprise to me as I did not have the slightest inkling of your plans. Innate means inborn. For example, Mozart's parents soon recognized young Wolfgang's innate talent for music. Innocuous means harmless. For example, an occasional glass of wine with dinner is relatively innocuous and should have no ill effect on you. Innovation means change, introduction of something new. For example, although Richard liked to keep up with all the latest technological innovations, he didn't always abandon tried and true techniques in favor of something new. Innovative means novel, introducing a change. For example, the establishment of our SATI computer database has enabled us to come up with some innovative tactics for doing well on the SAT. Innuendo means hint, insinuation. For example, I can defend myself against direct accusations. Innuendos and oblique attacks on my character are what trouble me. Inopportune means untimely, poorly chosen. For example, a rock concert is an inopportune setting for a quiet conversation. Inordinate means unrestrained, excessive. For example, she had an inordinate fondness for candy, eating 2 or 3 boxes in a single day. Inquisitor means questioner, investigator. For example, fearing being grilled ruthlessly by the secret police, Masha faced her inquisitors with trepidation. Insalubrious means unwholesome, not healthful. For example, the mosquito-ridden swamp was an insalubrious place, a breeding ground for malarial contagion. Insatiable means not easily satisfied, greedy. For example, David's appetite for oysters was insatiable. He could easily eat 4 dozen at a single sitting. Inscrutable means impenetrable, mysterious. For example, experienced poker players try to keep their expressions inscrutable, hiding their reactions to the cards behind a so-called poker face. Insensible means unconscious, unresponsive. For example, Sherry and I are very different. At times when I would be covered with embarrassment, she seems insensible to shame. Insidious means treacherous, stealthy. For example, the 5th column is insidious because it works secretly within our territory for our defeat. Insightful means discerning, perceptive. For example, Sol thought he was very insightful about human behavior, but he was actually clueless as to why people acted the way they did. Insinuate means hint, imply, creep in. For example, when you said I looked robust, did you mean to insinuate that I'm getting fat? Insipid means lacking in flavor, dull. For example, flat prose and flat ginger ale are equally insipid, both lack sparkle. Insolence means impudent disrespect. For example, how dare you treat me so rudely? The manager will hear of your insolence. Insolvent means bankrupt, unable to repay one's debts. For example, although young Lord Widgeon was insolvent, he had no fear of being thrown into debtor's prison, for he was sure that if his creditors pressed him for payment his wealthy parents would repay what he owed. Insomnia means wakefulness, inability to sleep. For example, he refused to join us in a midnight cup of coffee because he claimed it gave him insomnia. Instigate means urge, start, provoke. For example, rumors of police corruption led the mayor to instigate an investigation into the department's activities. Insubordination means disobedience, rebelliousness. For example, at the slightest hint of insubordination from the sailors of the Bounty, Captain Bligh had them flogged. Finally, they mutinied. Insubstantial means lacking substance, insignificant. For example, his hopes for a career in acting proved insubstantial. No one would cast him, even in an insubstantial role. Insularity means narrow-mindedness, isolation. For example, the insularity of the islanders manifested itself in their suspicion of anything foreign. Insulated means set apart, isolated. For example, a well-to-do bachelor, James spent his money freely, insulated from the cares of his friends, who had families to support. Insuperable means insurmountable, unbeatable. For example, though the odds against their survival seemed insuperable, the Apollo 13 astronauts reached Earth safely. Insurgent means rebellious. For example, because the insurgent forces had occupied the capital and had gained control of the railway lines, several of the war correspondents covering the uprising predicted a rebel victory. Insurmountable means overwhelming, unbeatable, insuperable. For example, faced by almost insurmountable obstacles, the members of the underground maintained their courage and will to resist. Insurrection means rebellion, uprising. For example, in retrospect, given how badly the British treated the American colonists, the eventual insurrection seems inevitable. Intangible means not able to be perceived by touch, vague. For example, though the financial benefits of his Oxford post were meager, Lewis was drawn to it by its intangible rewards, prestige, intellectual freedom, the fellowship of his peers. Integral means complete, necessary for completeness. For example, physical education is an integral part of our curriculum. A sound mind and a sound body are complementary. Integrate means make whole, combine, make into one unit. For example, she tried to integrate all their activities into one program. Integrity means uprightness, wholeness. For example, Lincoln, whose personal integrity has inspired millions, fought a civil war to maintain the integrity of the Republic, that these United States might remain undivided for all time. Intellect means higher mental powers. For example, he thought college would develop his intellect. Intelligentsia means the intelligent and educated classes. For example, she preferred discussions about sports and politics to the literary conversations of the intelligentsia. Intemperate means immoderate, excessive, extreme. For example, in a temper, Tony refused to tone down his intemperate remarks. Inter means bury. For example, they are going to inter the body tomorrow at Broadlawn Cemetery. Interim means meantime. For example, the company will not consider our proposal until next week. In the interim, let us proceed as we have in the past. Interloper means intruder, unwanted meddler. For example, the merchant thought of his competitors as interlopers who were stealing away his trade. Interment means burial. For example, interment will take place in the church cemetery at 2 p.m. Wednesday. Interminable means endless. For example, although his speech lasted for only 20 minutes, it seemed interminable to his bored audience. Intermittent means periodic, on and off. For example, the outdoor wedding reception had to be moved indoors to avoid the intermittent showers that fell on and off all afternoon. Interrogate means question closely, cross-examine. For example, knowing that the Nazis would interrogate him about his background, the secret agent invented a cover story that would help him meet their questions. Intervene means come between. For example, when two close friends get into a fight, be careful if you try to intervene. They may join forces to gang up on you. Intimacy means closeness, often affectionate. For example, in a moment of rare intimacy, the mayor allowed the reporters a glimpse of his personal feelings about his family. Intimate means hint, suggest. For example, was Dick intimating that Jane had bad breath when he asked if she'd like a breath mint? Intimidate means frighten. For example, I'll learn karate and then those big bullies won't be able to intimidate me anymore. Intractable means unruly, stubborn, unyielding. For example, Charlie Brown's friend Pigpen was intractable. He absolutely refused to take a bath. Intransigence means refusal of any compromise, stubbornness. For example, the negotiating team had not expected such intransigence from the striking workers, who rejected any hint of a compromise. Intrepid means fearless. For example, for her intrepid conduct nursing the wounded during the war, Florence Nightingale was honored by Queen Victoria. Intricate means complex, tangled. For example, Philip spent many hours designing mazes so intricate that none of his classmates could solve them. Intrinsic means essential, inherent, built-in. For example, although my grandmother's china has little intrinsic value, I shall always cherish it for the memories it evokes. Introspective means looking within oneself. For example, though young Francis of Assisi led a wild and worldly life, even then he had introspective moments during which he examined his soul. Introvert means inclined to think more about oneself. For example, in his poetry, he reveals that he is an introvert by his intense interest in his own problems. Intrude means trespass, enter as an uninvited person. For example, she hesitated to intrude on their conversation. Intuition means power of knowing without reasoning. For example, even though Tony denied that anything was wrong, Tina trusted her intuition that something was bothering him. Inundate means overwhelm, flood, submerge. For example, this semester I am inundated with work. You should see the piles of paperwork flooding my desk. Inured means accustomed, hardened. For example, she became inured to the Alaskan cold. Invalidate means weaken, destroy. For example, the relatives who received little or nothing sought to invalidate the will by claiming that the deceased had not been in his right mind when he had signed the document. Invasive means tending to spread aggressively, intrusive. For example, giving up our war with the invasive blackberry vines that had taken over the backyard, we covered the lawn with concrete. Invective means abuse. For example, he had expected criticism but not the invective that greeted his proposal. Inverse means opposite. For example, there is an inverse ratio between the strength of light and its distance. Invert means turn upside down or inside out. For example, when he inverted his body in a handstand, he felt the blood rush to his head. Inveterate means deep-rooted, habitual. For example, an inveterate smoker, Bob cannot seem to break the habit, no matter how hard he tries. Invidious means designed to create ill will or envy. For example, we disregarded her invidious remarks because we realized how jealous she was. Invigorate means energize, stimulate. For example, a quick dip in the pool invigorated Meg, and with renewed energy she got back to work. Invincible means unconquerable. For example, Superman is invincible. Inviolable means secure from corruption, attack, or violation. For example, Batman considered his oath to keep the people of Gotham City inviolable. Nothing on earth could make him break this promise. Invocation means prayer for help, calling upon as a reference. For example, the service of morning prayer opens with an invocation during which we ask God to hear our prayers. Invoke means call upon, ask for. For example, she invoked her advisor's aid in filling out her financial aid forms. Invulnerable means incapable of injury. For example, Achilles was invulnerable except in his heel. Iota means very small quantity. For example, she hadn't an iota of common sense. Irascible means irritable, easily angered. For example, Miss Minchin's irascible temper intimidated the younger schoolgirls, who feared she'd burst into a rage at any moment. Irate means angry. For example, when John's mother found out he had overdrawn his checking account for the third month in a row, she was so irate she could scarcely speak to him. Ire means anger. For example, the waiter tried unsuccessfully to placate the ire of the diner who had found a cockroach in her soup. Iridescent means exhibiting rainbow-like colors. For example, she admired the iridescent hues of the oil that floated on the surface of the water. Irksome means annoying, tedious. For example, he found working on the assembly line irksome because of the monotony of the operation he had to perform. Ironic means resulting in an unexpected and contrary outcome. For example, it is ironic that his success came when he least wanted it. Irony means hidden sarcasm or satire. For example, gradually his listeners began to realize that the excessive praise he was lavishing on his opponent was actually irony. He was in fact ridiculing the poor fool. Irrational means illogical, lacking reason, insane. For example, many people have such an irrational fear of snakes that they panic at the sight of a harmless garter snake. Irreconcilable means incompatible, not able to be resolved. For example, because the separated couple were irreconcilable, the marriage counselor recommended a divorce. Irrefutable means indisputable, incontrovertible, undeniable. For example, no matter how hard I tried to find a good comeback for her argument, I couldn't think of one. Her logic was irrefutable. Irrelevant means not applicable, unrelated. For example, no matter how irrelevant the patient's mumblings may seem, they give us some indications of what he has on his mind. Irremediable means incurable, uncorrectable. For example, the error she made was irremediable. She could see no way to repair it. Irreparable means not able to be corrected or repaired. For example, your apology cannot atone for the irreparable damage you have done to her reputation. Irrepressible means unable to be restrained or held back. For example, my friend Kitty's curiosity was irrepressible. She poked her nose into everybody's business and just laughed when I warned her that curiosity killed the cat. Irreproachable means blameless, impeccable. For example, Homer's conduct at the office party was irreproachable. Even Marge didn't have anything bad to say about how he behaved. Irresolute means uncertain how to act, weak. For example, once you have made your decision, don't waver. A leader should never appear irresolute. Irretrievable means impossible to recover or regain, irreparable. For example, the left fielder tried to retrieve the ball, but it flew over the fence, bounced off a wall, and fell into the sewer. It was irretrievable. Irreverence means lack of proper respect. For example, some audience members were amused by the irreverence of the comedian's jokes about the Pope. Others felt offended by his lack of respect for their faith. Irrevocable means unalterable, irreversible. For example, as Sue dropped the Dear John letter into the mailbox, she suddenly had second thoughts and wanted to take it back, but she could not. Her action was irrevocable. Itinerant means wandering, traveling. For example, he was an itinerant peddler and traveled through Pennsylvania and Virginia selling his wares. Itinerary means plan of a trip. For example, disliking sudden changes in plans when she traveled abroad, Ethel refused to make any alterations in her itinerary. End of the word list with words starting with letter I.